second objection, that is, there's a lack of neutrality in historical examination, also carries with it some weight when considered. But like the objection from a lack of direct access, this argument is also not as lethal of a blow to historical investigation as people often think. In order to clarify this objection, we need to determine how bias limits historical investigation, and then determine how historians cope. Note that I'm not saying that there is no hint of subjective thought within history. Truly, there is an element of subjectivism within many of the tools of investigation. Rather, what I'm communicating is that the level of stress placed on this subjective element so as to nullify history from communicating truth is without merit. Recall, for example, that it was suggested that science contains a subjective element as well. Yet this system is not decimated because of it. So to hold one method above the other would again be an example of a double standard. But what role does personal bias play in historical examination? Well, first and foremost, it would seem that all historians have biases, which are colored by their culture, race, nationality, gender, political, philosophical, and religious convictions. No historian is exempt. Biases are of great interest to historians since they are responsible, more than anything else, for their embarrassing diversity amongst the conflicting portraits of the past. Such biases can distort historical conclusions and thwart a historian's reach for the objective historical reality he is attempting to convey. This suggests that we be cautious in our attempts to use historical conclusions as evidence, but here I want to be cautious as well about the extent to which we allow biases to negate actual historical inquiry. If we are not careful, we throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Michael Licona notes that things are not as bleak as they first appear in regards to historical bias. Quote, for example, Giza Vermes left Catholicism for Judaism. Former biblical conservative Bart Ehrman is now an agnostic. Former atheist Craig Kerner became a biblical conservative. Oxford's Alistair McGrath describes his move from atheism to Christianity as an intellectually painful yet rewarding transition. C.S. Lewis converted from atheism to Christianity. Anthony Flew, perhaps the most influential atheist philosopher of the final 2 decades of the 20th century, became a deist in 2004. Thus, numerous examples demonstrate that it is possible to reduce the influence of one's biases. Although conversion is a strong sign that one's horizon or biases have been transcended, it does not follow that those historians who do not convert are unable to transcend their horizon or be objective in their inquiry. End quote. We will touch more in a moment on how historians can avoid their biases, but hopefully the degree to which bias allegedly debilitates historical investigation should now be minimized, or at least put in its place. In sum, the fact that historians have biases does not outright negate objective historical investigation. To see this, consider the following points. Michael Licona has published a list of 6 factors that he believes helps historians avoid bias in historical methodology. These 6 criteria are as follows. 1. Proper and clear use of historical method. 2. Clear and explicit acknowledgement of historians' personal biases. 3. Presentation of conclusions to peer review. 4. Submission of conclusions to experts with unsympathetic views. 5. Use and emphasis on the common core or historical bedrock of facts. And 6. A conscientious effort of detachment from one's own personal biases. I will touch briefly on a few of these. One such safeguard that serves to limit bias is what is called the common core of indisputable facts, or the historical bedrock. Such a pool of undeniable facts is established so strongly that they are virtually indisputable. For example, consider the following historical fact. The American Civil War began on April 12, 1861 and ended on April 9, 1865. What could be disputed in this proposition could be the dates, for example, but the common core that one cannot debate is that the Civil War actually took place. This fact would be considered as a virtually indisputable fact that is supported by multiple written sources, such as letters and documents, archaeological findings, battle sites, for example, photos, and credible eyewitnesses, for example, the President of the United States or soldiers. In this way, the common core speaks for itself, thus removing the caution that history is nothing more than the opinions and theories of men. If historical relativism were really true, and the lack of neutrality was the nail in the coffin of historical investigation, then we could most likely see persuasive denials of such events, Yet we do not see persuasive denials, and any who do attempt to deny such events as the Civil War are rightfully viewed as a fringe hypothesis. Licona states, quote, "If an hypothesis fails to explain all the historical bedrock, it is time to drag that hypothesis back to the drawing board or to relegate it to the trash bin. The value of such an approach is that it places a check on narrative," end quote. Hence, objective facts do seem to exist, although they are provisional, but it would be very difficult to think that future finds will lead to the negation of the American Civil War. The second safeguard against bias is historians' ability to distinguish between history and propaganda. Again, if biases were a lethal blow to history, then we would expect to see no real distinction between the popularized rants or rantings of the biased historian and propaganda, because the two would be synonymous. But this is not the case. There is a clear difference between the Nazi Aryan history, or Stalin's revision of history, with what actually took place. Given the sheer number of sources and eyewitness testimony of the actual events, one can piece together the historical bedrock. Morton White charges that the most dangerous component of historical relativism is the way it can be used to justify historical distortions via propaganda. This point is brilliantly depicted in George Orwell's novel 1984, A Common Read. Within this novel, whatever the party says about the past is true, and thus history is relative. The inherent danger in this is obviously clear. If historical facts have no meaning and can be interpreted to say whatever the historian wants, then there is no method to test propaganda from history. Yet this is not the case. Thus, the existence of a clear distinction between history and propaganda demonstrates not only that biases can be caught, but that the ability to distinguish between them serves as a limitation on bias. The third safeguard against bias in historical investigation is the ability to criticize poorly constructed historical narratives. Take, for example, Immanuel Velikovsky's rewrite of history. Many within the historical community have criticized such reinterpretations of historical fact. However, the ability to quantify what is poor and well established would be to admit that historical facts themselves say something and are not ideas that can be twisted to suit any historian's hypothesis. In other words, to criticize poorly reconstructed history is to acknowledge the objectivity of history. This point emphasizes the importance of peer review in historical investigation. Historians ought to offer their conclusions for peer review as to add peer pressure, as it were, to act as a check on individual bias. Fourth, explicit historical method is crucial in eliminating investigation driven by the historian's personal bias. Historians can use two general methods, the hypothetical deductive model or an inference to the best possible explanation. The former was detailed at the end of my response to the lack of direct access objection, thus I would like to focus on the later method. In the inference to the best possible explanation, a list of criteria are used to formulate conclusions and then compare said conclusions to others to see which meets the criteria the best. Thus, the historian still examines the common core of facts in the historical bedrock and forms an hypothesis to account for those facts. But then the historian compares his conclusions with others to see which, for example, has more explanatory scope or which has less ad hoc. In applying a method such as this, bias may still be present, but it becomes increasingly difficult to use bias as a guiding rod due to the factors within historical method, for example, comparison, historical bedrock, neutral criteria, etc. In addition, if the historian accepts methodological neutrality when examining sources and texts versus mythology or credulity or skepticism, then the burden of proof is placed in the correct spot, i.e. on the one making the claim. Licona points out a crucial difference between methodological neutrality versus skepticism with the resurrection of Jesus as an example. Quote, "The main difference then between methodological neutrality and methodological skepticism concerns burden of proof. All historians bear the responsibility of defending their hypotheses. The one claiming Jesus was resurrected must bear the burden of showing that Jesus was resurrected. The text cannot be regarded as being truthful until proven otherwise, at least not when they are part of an historical investigation. In methodological neutrality, scholars claiming that something other than Jesus' resurrection occurred likewise bear the burden of proof to support the occurrence of that something else, whatever it is. It will not do to assert that X could have occurred without providing a coherent and compelling reason that X is more probable than the resurrection hypotheses," end quote. Thus, with a clear method guiding investigation and methodological neutrality assumed with text, biases can be muted more effectively. Lastly, biases do not always have to result in negative alterations in historical inquiry. Consider an example given by Gary Habermas. Quote, "Modern Jewish historians of the Nazi Holocaust have very carefully chronicled Nazi atrocities because they are passionately committed to exposing what really occurred. Whereas revisionist historians, usually Gentile, tend to downplay the facts. In this case, personal bias encourages historical accuracy." End quote. In this example, bias serves as a positive role, that is, in a passion to record actual events that are being suppressed. It is for these reasons that it seems untenable to maintain that historical inquiry is befuddled due to human bias. Yes, bias is present and should make us cautious in our conclusions. However, not only are there multiple examples of historians that have just transcended their biases, but also the extent that biases is said to harm history can be, and is, muted by the several factors listed above. Thus, it seems to me that bias, at most, causes us to be cautious. It does nothing to negate historical investigation.